This is going to be a very quick, straightforward, no frills disassembly and reassembly of this Honda GCV160. And we're starting down here at the spark plug. Pull that spark plug boot off, use a 13/16, and there's your spark plug. Next, you want to drain the fuel from this fuel line here. Loosen the gas cap, but keep it on there. You don't want anything going into the tank. Take a pair of pliers, put down a rag, have your gas can, your funnel, pull that sucker off.
And if you can't tell by now, I'm gonna speed run through most of the disassembly, but I'll slow down for the important parts and definitely slow down for the reassembly.
All right, tighten the gas cap again. You got these 3 10mm nuts. Lift that starter up. You should be able to just lift that tank up. Remove these 3 special bolts using a 10mm. This you can just slide off. Remove that 10mm, and now the ignition coil is free. This is the spark plug boot that we disconnected in the first step, and that's the ignition coil. Ignore this. Yours should be flat on both sides like that. This is a brand new one. This is the old one that I damaged. Take off the heat shield and the muffler. There's your heat shield. And there's your exhaust.
This side of the engine can be confusing because there's a lot of connected pieces, but what I'm gonna show you is what makes the most sense to me.
It's another 10mm. Now you can just pull the governor arm off that shaft. Disconnect this spring down here. You have more room to remove it from this linkage. There's still this wire here. So just rotate the governor, and now it's free. That's another 10mm. There's 2 tabs. Just press down from the top. Pull this air filter off. Now you've got 3 bolts here. Remove this top one first. So there's the carburetor. Should have enough room now. Take that throttle, undo the linkage there, get that kill switch out of the way, come down at an angle like that, it just pops right out. This choke is attached to the control panel with these rubber, I don't know what you call them, but you can just pull them out. There's another one of those rubber things down here, and the choke lever's out. Remove this emissions hose, remove this fuel line, pull that line off. Now you have a carburetor that's free. The next order of business is getting this flywheel off. You've got to remove this flywheel nut, and then you can lift it up with a puller. If you try to fit your ratchet on there and turn it to loosen, you're just gonna spin that flywheel. This is torqued down to 54 foot-pounds of torque. You're gonna really dig into your hands if you're trying to loosen this nut. What you could do is fit a pry bar in between these posts like that, and then fit your ratchet on and loosen it that way. I just went out and got an impact wrench. You'll need a 19mm. Fit it over. It makes easy work of it.
Next, we need a 2-jaw puller to pull the flywheel off of the crankshaft.
You want to fit the hooks of the puller into those sections that have more clearance. If I spin it 180, there's another section. Align that center post directly above the crankshaft. Once you feel you've got a good fit, just tighten it a little bit more. You'll need an 18mm. At this point, when it feels so tight, I just grab and I use my body to push on this. There you go. Just like that, you can remove the flywheel. Next, there's that key, and you can pull that guy out. There you go. And while that's draining, I think this is a good time to talk about the carburetor. You've got the drain bolt there. You've got another bolt down here. Open that drain bolt. Next, remove that bottom bolt. And now this bowl just comes right off. There's a little bit of varnish in there. You have the float there, which is held in by that pin. So you can just knock that pin out. Now you can lift up on the float. That's the float. That's your float needle. And in there is your main jet. Just take a small flathead. See how it's a lot closer to the surface now? Sometimes you'll be able to get it out like that, but if you can't, you can press down on the emulsion tube in there. And now, those come out. That's your main jet. You see that hole in the center? You should have a clear hole in the center. Clear hole there. Clear over there. And then the final thing that you can pull out is that idle circuit screw. Just fit a screwdriver in there. Inside is your pilot jet. It leads to those small holes right there. That is the carburetor. 4 10mm. Just lift it up enough so that you can fit a pry bar underneath. There it is.
Next, remove the 8 bolts holding the 2 halves of the crankcase together.
With the bolts out, now we just have to pry it apart along this groove, and on the other side, another groove right there. Okay, just for the pop.
I'm just taking a second to appreciate the internals. All right, let's keep going. Flip it around and we're gonna remove the cam pin. By removing the cam pin, we relax a lot of the tension on that timing belt, making it a lot easier to slip off of the camshaft. These 2 ticks on the camshaft are timing indicators that help you synchronize the camshaft with the position of the piston. More on that in the reassembly. As you pull the timing belt out, make note of which side was facing up. Something I do is look at the print on the side and see if the letters were right side up or upside down. And now we're coming to the most delicate part of the disassembly. As you loosen the 2 bolts holding the rod cap to the connecting rod, make sure not to damage the oil slinger. This thing will bend or break very easily, and without it you wouldn't have lubrication. Once you've got the bolts out, you can just pull on the rod cap. Rotate the crankshaft until the connecting rod disconnects. Position the crankshaft so that the counterweights and the journal won't hit the connecting rod as you pull it out of the engine. Pulling the piston out is tricky, so good luck, man. Try your best not to hit the piston on the crankcase. Look around the piston for any deep marks like this one. The rule of thumb is that if you can feel it with a fingernail, it's too deep. Do the same thing inside the cylinder. Let's flip it around and start taking out the valves. Push down on the spring and slide the valve stem to the wider opening on the spring retainer. Take off the retainer and the spring, push the valve through, catch it on the other side. Do the same thing on the exhaust side, and don't forget the valve seal on the intake side. Now you've got the valves, the spring retainer, and the valve seal. The 2 valves look very similar, but the intake is slightly bigger, and it has a bowl on its face. And with that, we're done with the engine disassembly. Let's clean it before we put it back together. Easily the most time-consuming part of cleaning the engine is scraping all of the sealant residue off of the edge of the crankcase and on the valve cover. Get in it with some plastic scrapers, knives, picks, whatever you need to get it out. Find any dirty spots and take a wire brush to them. Whether it's rust or fuel buildup in the carburetor, just take a wire brush to them and try to get as much off as you can. Once you're done scrubbing, grab some engine degreaser and spray everything inside the engine. That's the crankcase itself, the crankshaft, the cylinder, piston, everything that was inside, leaving you a clean surface to reapply lubrication. You let that engine degreaser sit on there for a few minutes, and in the meantime you can pull out that carburetor and spray through all the ports with carburetor cleaner. Just blow that carburetor cleaner through all the ports. My carburetor bowl was especially dirty, so I just sprayed a little carburetor cleaner in there, just let it sit for a few minutes and took a wire brush to it, and a lot of it came off. I also bought these welding tip cleaners. I just fit the thickest wire I could into all of the ports in the carburetor. Once that engine degreaser has been sitting on there for a while, rinse it off and then completely dry it. You do not want any water left inside. And now our engine is spick and span brand new. It's time to put it all back together. First order of business are the valves. I'm starting with the exhaust, and these are straightforward. You just push the valve through, you fit the spring and the retainer over, clip it into place, and do the same thing on the intake side. But you've got that intake valve seal, so make sure you put that on before the spring. If you ever lose track of which side is intake and which is exhaust, just look for the hose. The hose is intake. Next, we're moving on to the piston, arguably the most nerve-wracking part. Why do I say that? Because I've already broken a set of piston rings and had to wait a couple of days and spend $20 for no good reason other than that I rushed the process my first time around. There are 3 piston rings and each one has a gap to them, number 1, 2, and 3. Each of these gaps have to be separated by 120 degrees before you put the piston back into the cylinder. And none of the gaps can be right above a wrist pin. I didn't show it in this video, but if you take the piston rings off, be careful because they're brittle like dry spaghetti. To put them back on, start with the oil control ring, which is in that bottommost channel on the piston. You've got this gold oil expander straddled by 2 spacer rings. The expander ring has a raised edge on one end. Put that raised edge right up against the piston wall. The 2 compression rings look very similar. The one that goes in the middle is what's called the black face. It's black throughout the whole ring. This one has a chrome edge. That black face is what goes in the middle. Make sure the letters are pointing up. To put them on, just hook one edge into the channel and then roll it into place. But again, be careful with the dry spaghetti. Numero uno, when you're putting the piston back in, is lube it up. Lube it up nice and heavy. Spread it on the piston, spread it in the cylinder. Spread it everywhere. The gaps on the piston rings have to be separated by 120 degrees. And none of the gaps can be above the wrist pin. Now you want to orient the piston so that the longer side of the connecting rod is pointing to the right of the crankcase as you're inserting it. This makes fitting the rod cap easier. Getting that first compression ring in is not too bad. I just clamp that first ring down with my fingers and then it just pops into place. But getting that second compression ring in is pretty tricky. Try your best. Honestly, the only advice is good luck. If you get the piston in, congratulations. Now just slide it back and forth and make sure you don't feel too much friction against the cylinder walls. Push the piston to top dead center, being careful not to slam it against the valves. Next we can move on to lubing up the crankshaft journal and the connecting rod bearing. Once you got that shaft all lubed up, put it in so that the timing gear is on top. Once the shaft is fully seated, find that sweet spot where the connecting rod sits nicely on the crankshaft journal. Grab your rod cap, orient it so that the oil slinger is on the right and on the bottom. Push it into place. Grab your 2 bolts, hand tighten them, spin the crankshaft so that that rod cap is facing outboard, and finally grab that torque wrench to torque these to 9 foot-pounds of torque. Bounce between the 2 to bring them up to 9 foot-pounds together. Once it's tightened down, spin the crankshaft around to bring the piston back to top dead center. There's that keyway on the crankshaft. That should be pointing directly up towards the valves. Grab your timing belt. Are the letters supposed to be right side up or upside down? I'm not sure. I hope you remember. Slip it over the crankshaft and pull it up to the valves. Then grab your camshaft and insert it so that those 2 timing indicators are flush with the edge of the valve cover. Fit the timing belt over. And if you see that those indicators are not flush with the edge, you can adjust the timing 1 tooth at a time. Once you've got it lined up pretty good, put the cam pin back in with that notched edge facing outboard. Congratulations, you've just timed your engine. Next, grab your gasket maker, aka liquid sealant. Do a first pass around the edge of the crankcase, and then go back with your finger or another instrument and just spread it evenly. The important thing here is that you want a nice layer on every section of the edge. You do not want any metal showing. Grab the other half of the crankcase and marry them together. Throw the 8 bolts in and loosely tighten them by hand, and then go back and torque them down to 9 foot-pounds of torque in this sequence.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8.
Flip the engine over. It's time to put in the rockers. Slip them on. Grab your rocker pins, and you'll notice that there's a ledge on one end. This is to keep the pin from falling through the hole. Insert the pin with that ledge on top of the rocker. With the rockers in, we've got to adjust the valve clearances. The clearance for intake is 0.6 of an inch, and for exhaust, it's 0.8 of an inch. But there's a plus or minus 0.2 of an inch margin. Loosen the 9mm nut. Slide the feeler gauge in the gap and then use a pair of pliers or your fingers to grab onto that center post to either loosen or tighten the clearance. And what you're going for here is to feel a bit of friction as you slide that feeler gauge in the gap. You don't want so much friction that you can barely move the gauge, but you don't want so little friction that it feels like it's just floating in there. Here I've got my 8/1000 of an inch for the exhaust side. Notice how it's not fitting into the gap at first, but as soon as I loosen it, it starts sliding in there slowly. Once you got a good fit, tighten it down, but make sure you don't move that center post as you tighten the nut. Once you're done, grab your sealant and spread it along the edge of the valve cover. Find this thing, set it over the holes with that metal tab on the same side as the cam pin. Press it down and then grab those 4 bolts. Tighten them down to 9 foot-pounds of torque. And at this point, I was running out of daylight, so I started rushing everything. Put the exhaust on. Spent 10 minutes looking for the bolts holding in the heat shield just to realize I left them at home. So then I moved on to the flywheel. I inserted the key, and on the flywheel there's this notch for the key. Make sure you line that up with the key as you push it down. Tighten the flywheel nut, and then I put the spark plug in. Then I realized the video quality was going to be poor, so I just waited till the next morning. And on my drive over, I realized I didn't even torque the flywheel nut to 54 foot-pounds of torque. So that's the first thing I did. Get the heat shield on, pour some oil in. Now we're going to reassemble the carburetor, starting with the emulsion tube. Stick it in with that side going in first. Take your flathead and push it through. Now you should be able to see it sticking out into the venturi tube of the carburetor. Then your main jet, tap it in, and use that flathead to screw it in just until it bites. Don't over tighten it. Screw in the idle circuit screw. I go all the way and then I back it out a turn. Get your float pin and stick that flat edge into the shelf on the float. Don't overthink it, it only goes in one way. We're putting the needle in this smaller hole right here. Slide that float pin in. Slap the bowl on. Put the 2 bolts in and then tighten them. Reattach the fuel line to the carburetor and bring that retaining clip up to the groove where it used to sit. Grab the choke lever and put it in the bottom hole on the choke. Then on the throttle, you'll notice that one side has all these hooks in it. That's the side that gets attached to the carburetor. Feed the wire through the smaller of the 2 holes on the throttle. Hook the throttle lever through. Pull out any slack in the wire because you want it sitting flush against the throttle. Now it's time to mount the carburetor and all the gaskets to those 2 long bolts that came with the air filter. Notice on this plastic piece that cutout has 2 ears on either side. That tells you that the first gasket you need to use is this Mickey Mouse one that has the 2 ears on both sides. Line it up so that small hole to the top left right there lines up with the small hole on that plastic piece. Next is the metal control panel. Just line up that hole to the hole. Next is this rubber gasket, and again line up the holes. Then goes the carburetor, and you guessed it, hole to hole. Then you put this guy on, and then your final gasket. This is important. Bring that kill switch all the way to the top so it's out of the way of everything else. Hand thread it to the case. Fit those rubber circles on the choke lever back into their brackets. Reattach the emissions hose. Hook the throttle wire through the smaller of the 2 holes on the governor, and then the lever. Slide the governor onto its shaft. Reattach the spring on the bottom. Loosely insert this bolt and that one, and once you feel like you got a good fit all around, tighten everything down. Grab that T-shaped bolt and set it in horizontally. There's a notch on the bottom of the governor arm that won't allow this bolt to fully seat if you insert it vertically. Then we got the ignition coil. It's bolted down on the left by one of the 3 special bolts, and on the right by just a regular bolts. Don't tighten them all the way because you have to adjust the gap in between the coil and the flywheel. You could either use 1/100th of an inch or a business card. And the proper way to do this is to slip in that feeler gauge or the business card and then rotate the flywheel to the magnet so that the ignition coil is pulled to the flywheel with that spacer in between, and then you tighten it. Reattach the kill switch. And just as a tangent, at this point, you could test whether your ignition module is working properly. Take out the spark plug, set the tip of the spark plug on some bare metal, flip your engine on, spin your flywheel, and you should see some sparks from your plug. And now I'm just putting it all back together. Topping off the oil. Attaching the other two special bolts. Slipping the gas tank on, reattaching the fuel line, setting the starter back on, adding gas, opening the fuel line, giving it a good shake to prime it, and turning the engine over to distribute the oil that we just added. And here I'm realizing that I never adjusted the governor, and I was gonna fix it, but decided not to and just see what the engine was gonna do. This is just a time lapse of me turning it over. And now let's turn it on. As soon as I turned it over, I heard it running away from me, so I just turned it off, and let's fix that governor. So to correctly set the governor, pull that arm all the way back, then grab a set of pliers, hold onto the shaft that the governor is sitting on, and rotate it all the way clockwise. Once it's fully rotated, keep pulling the governor arm, then retighten the nut, and now the governor should be properly set, so that if we start the engine now, it won't run away on us. I went back home to edit this video and I saw how much it was vibrating at the end, and I didn't like that, so I came back with the pressure washer stand to see if it would vibrate less if I bolted it on, and it worked. Made it this far, hopefully you'll also stick around for my next video where I go through this engine to explain how all the components work.